Hello and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Infinite Learning's webinar today. My name is Rebecca Anand. I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Infinite Learning. We are delighted to be running this webinar today in partnership with Hannah Wilson. She's the co-founder of Women Ed and Diverse Ed, amongst many other skills to her name, and I'm sure she'll share some of those with you a little bit later. But of course, Hannah is here really today to talk about our forthcoming Real conference. So in partnership with Hannah, it's something we've been discussing for a long time. Working with her Real brand is to put on a conference and really start running a series of events aimed at women in education and in other industries as well. So the conference, as you probably know, is taking place on Thursday, the 27th of May. Sorry, on the Saturday, the 26th of June. But if you book by Thursday, the 27th of May, there is an early bird discount, and that's 75 dirhams. So it's quite significant. So do think about getting your booking in for that as soon as you can. So in the introductory webinar today, Hannah is going to reflect on what it means to be an authentic leader. We're going to discuss how we can empower ourselves and empower others to lead. We're also going to consider how we can develop our resilience as leaders. And Hannah will, of course, also be touching on some of the details around what you can expect in the conference coming up in June. Now, before I hand over to Hannah, just a few small areas of housekeeping. Attendees, you are automatically on mute. We had 134 delegates registered for this webinar, so understandably, on mute is the best way forward. If you have any questions as we go through, please do enter them into the chat area, and Paola and I will look at those as we go along, and then there'll be time for Q&A with Hannah and myself at the end of the webinar. Questions we often get asked, will there be a recording of the webinar? Yes, this will be sent to you tomorrow around about 5 o'clock. We'll also send out an email immediately after this webinar, which will have a copy of PowerPoint, so you don't need to take loads of notes, you can just sit back and enjoy and engage. And you will also receive a certificate of attendance tomorrow as well. Okay, so without further ado, Hannah, over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's great to be here, everyone. Afternoon. It's 1 o'clock for me over in Oxford in the UK, but I know it's later in the day, almost gin or cup of tea time for you all over there. So the title of our conference is Empowered Women, Empower Women. And you've probably heard this phrase or seen this GIF or meme before on social media, but it's something that I really stand behind. That I know that I'm an empowered woman, but I'm an empowered woman because other people have empowered me. And I believe in paying that forward and passing that on and thinking about how we can collectively peer support each other. And I'm going to share a little bit about my journey with you this afternoon, about how I've gone about building that circle of support around me. So as Rebecca said, I'm the co-founder of 2 grassroots organisations that I'll speak about more later on, Women Ed and Diverse Ed. Since leaving headship, I'm now working independently for the first time in 20 years, and I'm a leadership development consultant, coach and trainer. And part of my story today is about my coaching journey and creating to become a coach in the last year. If you are active on social media, please do find me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I tweet as Ethical Leader and I blog as Ethical Leader. So I'd love to connect with you following the session. So take a moment to think about, why are we here? I know why I'm here, but why are you here? Why have you given up an hour of your time this afternoon to come and join us? And what is it that's perhaps resonated with you about this opportunity to join us this afternoon for the webinar, but also potentially to come to the conference in the future? I'm not sure if you're all familiar with Simon Sinek's Start With Why. It's the most watched TED Talk in history. Brilliant, brilliant book. So let me just let that question sit with you for a second. Why are we here? And our whys are likely to be quite different for each of us individually. So some of you might be here because you're an aspiring leader. Some might be an existing leader. Some might be a leader who's about to start a new role or apply for a new opportunity. You might be a woman who's working in a context where you haven't got a support circle around you and you want to network. You might be a parent returning from a maternity leave or somebody on maternity leave. So there'll be lots of different reasons why we're here, but there'll be some commonality as well about connections, collaborations, and thinking about a community of support. So one of the reasons why I'm here is that every year I very much engage with celebrations and the marking of International Women's Day. So each year they choose a different theme, and this year's theme is Choose to Challenge. And that theme really speaks to me in a lot of my network about what can we each individually choose to challenge. Choose to challenge in ourselves, choose to challenge in others, and choose to challenge in the system, be that our school or our schools group or wider society. So here are some of the examples of pledges that people made this year, that things they wanted, micro and macro, to begin to challenge. And as women leaders in education, there's things we want to challenge in ourselves and others, the adults, but I'm also a big believer in the legacy of what are we doing differently for the girls in the schools we serve in order to help them navigate the future, and how can we begin to influence change in wider society for gender equity, gender equality. So as I said a minute ago, I've trained to coach in the last year. I've always been actively involved in coaching. I've done a number of coaching courses over the years. The power of coaching for me has been really impactful in helping me get that clarity along the way on my journey as a leader. And I've always been asked to do a lot of coaching, and I've kind of dabbled with it. I've always been very busy and not had the chance to do the qualification. So since leaving headship in the last year, I've accredited to be a Resilient Leaders Elements coach. And it's a very specific way of coaching. They've got a framework, and these 4 elements are the kind of the foundations of the framework. So through the coaching, we think about our clarity of direction, so the journey we're on, where we're heading and why we're heading there and how we're going to get there. Our awareness, so thinking about our awareness of self, our awareness of others, and our awareness of the environment. Leadership presence, and thinking about our own authenticity, how we are in service of others and our intent. And then resilient decision making, thinking about the range of decisions we need to make about our lives, be those questions be creative or versatile or robust. So that's the kind of the framework we use. And you can see faintly underneath those 4 circles, there's 2 statements: what I do and who I am. And I'm not sure about you, but for my 20 years in education, I've had a very strong sense of my professional identity in the workplace and my personal identity when I'm not at work. And sometimes those two can be in sort of conflict with each other, can be a bit of friction, because perhaps the values that are really important to you in life aren't being replicated and mirrored to you where you're working. So there's something here about alignment and how we do the work on ourselves in order to understand how we show up and how we have impact. So the reason why I'm giving you that as context is that as part of my training program for 6 months as a coach, we thought about how might we then individually, as the coaches and the consultants, leverage and utilize the framework and the learning and the coaching approach out in the wider world and through our work. So thinking about where I can have impact and the things that I can offer to my network and beyond, I began to think about and design this program and this series of opportunities called REAL. So you can see that RLE is in there, but I've just sort of like tweaked it a little bit. So for me, being a real woman in education is about being resilient. It's about being empowered. It's about being truly authentic, and it's about harnessing and leveraging our leadership. So that's what REAL stands for in my sort of like lens. So I want us just to unpack these 4 words. We hear them bandied around all the time. So let's take a moment to think about our resilience. As educators, our resilience is tested all the time. But in the last 12 months, our resilience in our profession has been tested to a whole new level. Then you throw into the mix those of you who have got parenting and caring responsibilities, and the double bind of being a professional and being a parent and a carer. And then you throw into the mix lockdown and the global pandemic. I don't think we're ever going to have a year that tests us, has the adversity and the obstacles and the challenges that the last 12 months have had. So if you didn't think you were resilient before what's happened in the last year, I would really reflect on actually just how resilient you are. So have a look at these 6 images and just have a think about which of them most resonate with you when you think about your own personal and professional resilience. Is it the person stood there with the kind of the roots holding them up? because you quite often see the metaphor for resilience of a tree bending in the wind, but it never falls over, it never gets upturned. Or are you that figure pushing a big heavy ball up a mountain and feeling quite lone and quite isolated? It's like a massive endeavour. The one that resonated with me a few years ago was this piece of string or this rope that was being frayed from the pressure being exerted on it until it gets to the point where it snaps or it's separated. Or perhaps the one in the middle at the bottom there, that shoot of hope, that plant that's finding the light and it's growing in a climate that perhaps isn't the climate it's used to. So thinking about our resilience and how we nurture our resilience and how we flex our resilience, I think is part of both our professional and our personal identities. But quite often we have more resilience in our toolkit that we can tap into from our personal lives that perhaps we don't leverage in our professional lives. So thinking about empowerment, you can probably tell I'm an English teacher. I like to unpack words and understand what words mean. So thinking about the act of empowering, empowering somebody else, but also the act of empowering yourself. There's different images here that's capturing some of the things that I think about when it comes to empowerment. So top left, you're probably familiar with the kind of the Amy Cuddy power pose and how we project empowerment. We might not always believe it. The inner critic, the imposter syndrome might be very alive and very loud, but how can we empower ourselves and how can we project that confidence? So this Girl Can campaign is all about empowering women to lean into things they don't perhaps do, such as certain sports, and how can we pass the baton on to the next generation? The top right one for me is all about voice and agency. There's lots of research about when women become leaders and they get themselves that seat at the table or they join the leadership room, sometimes they're in the room, but verbally they're not in the room because it's very hard to interject and to verbalise and articulate themselves in quite a rowdy leadership environment. So Sheryl Sandberg in Lean In talks about not only being in the room, but also taking your voice into the room as well. So thinking about empowerment, it's a fine balance about empowering other people, but creating that self-efficacy in the individuals to then be empowered themselves as well. So maybe just take a moment to think about who empowers you and who are you empowering? I'm not sure if you can see bottom left, but there's a mixture of genders and sexes in that image, because I think empowerment for me, when it comes to women's empowerment, is also about our he for she advocates and allies. That feminism isn't just women supporting women, it's about us in society, in a wider culture, thinking about how we can have these conversations with other stakeholders and our colleagues. And I've worked with some brilliant male colleagues over the years who have opened doors for me and tapped me on the shoulder and created opportunities for me. I've also worked with male colleagues who have been quite difficult to navigate when I was the only woman on an all-male SLT, for example. Authenticity is a word that comes a lot when it comes to leadership, but particularly women in leadership. I'm sure you won't disagree that quite a lot of the leadership models and tropes that get perpetuated in society, the narratives we read about, the stuff we learn about when we do leadership courses, there's quite often a very autocratic or didactic way of leading. And there's an analogy about the mold being made by men for men. And actually, what does it mean to be a woman leader, a feminist leader, a feminine leader? How do we do that in an authentic way where we don't lose ourselves along the way, or where we don't try and wedge ourselves, a woman's body, into a man-shaped mold? So thinking about this idea of authenticity and how we show up and the choices we make about how we talk, how we behave, how we dress, how we interact. I've been fascinated in my career watching women almost manifest themselves as they become leaders and begin to dress and talk in a certain way. And then I've seen other women who have completely embraced themselves and won't get told what they can wear or what they can't wear. So just think about this idea of what drives us, our own motivations, our values and our ethics, but also how that then manifests itself, I guess, in different spaces. And the two images at the bottom there about masks. I run a lot of women's programs, I sit in a lot of women's circle spaces, and I predominantly coach women. And we talk quite a lot about the masks we put on and the masks we take off. So one of the things to think about around authenticity is the emotional labour it takes to put our armour on and to put our masks on and to pretend to be something we're not. That takes up energy that might perhaps be better spent in a different way and might have more impact in a different way. And if we could have these open conversations in workspaces about different ways of leading, different ways of being, showing that there's different approaches and there's a diversity there, it might just give permission to other women in our circles and our networks to also take those masks off as well. And that leads us into the fourth one, the idea of leadership or leadership presence. I think one of the biggest requests I've had from coaching is, can we talk about gravitas? Can we talk about presence? I'm a female leader, but I want to be visibly or physically more present. So thinking about the presence we have when we're in the room, but also thinking about the presence we have when we're not in the room. I believe leadership is all about creating legacy and thinking about the kind of the processes and the systems and the things we do that actually influence other people. And when it comes to leadership, there's lots of gendered language and gender behaviours. And I love this picture of Jessica from Suits that some of you might watch and might be familiar with. And she very much owns this idea of being the boss. But the boss is an example of a masculine sort of label for leaders. We don't very often hear of women being bosses. We quite often hear women being called bossy though. And there's some subtle sort of like gendered language, gender behaviours that we need to keep chipping away at and keep challenging. I particularly like the image bottom middle. I mentioned moulds earlier on. I can remember being at a conference a few years back and Germaine Greer, the feminist theorist and writer and speaker was there. And she was talking about this idea of we as women have got to stop wedging our bodies into moulds made by men for men. And that's why I just absolutely love this sculptural piece about this woman breaking free from the mould. And then on the right-hand side there, you've got Amy Cuddy, who I've mentioned already, in the idea of the power pose. So I've got a friend who I do a lot of coaching with. We run programs together, and she talks about our leadership presence being like perfume. We choose how we smell, and we choose what is left in the room when we leave the room. That lingering kind of scent where people know you've been there and your footprint's there and your presence is felt and smelled even though you're not in the room. So I just want to think about how we can, as women, show up in an authentic way, create that presence and that impact, but do it in a way that feels authentic to us as well. So through the coaching I've had over the last few years, and I think I started receiving coaching when I became an assistant head teacher, and I worked my way through being assistant head to deputy head to head and then to executive head before working independently. And one of the things I've kind of done a lot of exploration of is who is Hannah when Hannah's not doing the job? Because I can switch it on and off when I'm doing the role. I know how to behave, I know how to perform, I know how to conform and how to comply. And I am a very fiercely authentic person, but at times I have perhaps lost myself a little bit in the roles. The roles have become all-consuming. And when we talk about the kind of leaders that we are, I'm very much a servant leader. I'm in service of the children who I teach and the staff who I lead and the parents and the carers within the wider community who I serve. But quite often it's about service of others at the expense of service of self. And I hear this time and time again with different women who I work with about making sure that we are serving ourselves and our own needs, as well as thinking about that wider community piece. And that we're thinking about who we are as a whole person, and we're not chopping and changing. So that kind of that consistency in who we are, that is the best use of our energy and our emotionality. So those two questions of who I am and what I do that we use in our release week, it has been an interesting process for me. I think I've spent the last 20 years leading with the what I do, the job title, the status, the kind of what comes with that. People understand what it is to be a teacher, a school leader, a head teacher. And when I left headship and was thinking about how to describe myself working independently, it took me a long time to decide what words to use to describe who I am. But just take a moment to think about when you are networking and connecting with new people, how do you introduce yourself? Do you introduce yourself as being a feminist or a mother or a wife, or do you introduce yourself with your job title? Because we quite often, I think, lead with that professional identity, which in turn perhaps diminishes the rest of who we are. So in all the programs I run and all the events I run, I always ask people to think about, who are your role models? Who are your visible role models? Who are the people who you look to? You watch them, you observe them, you listen to them, and they shape who you are. And when we think about this idea of being real, who are our visible, resilient, empowered, authentic leaders? And there's a couple of examples here. I think the last 12 months, despite everything that has been very challenging and at times quite emotionally distressing, at the same time, we have seen some fantastic women leaders really rise and really begin to demonstrate the different behaviours and the different ways of leading that perhaps we can learn from. And when we're identifying and we're observing these visible role models, I then ask people to think about how might we emulate some of those behaviours. How do they dress? How do they speak? How do they hold themselves? How do they articulate themselves? And how can we look to those role models, and whether they're on a global stage or whether in our school groups or whether in our friendship groups, but at the same time, whether we choose to accept it or not, we are also all role models for other people. Other staff, junior staff, will be looking to you for how you hold yourself and how you behave. The girls in our primary schools and secondary schools and sixth forms will also be looking to us to model those behaviours. So how can we collectively begin to disrupt and dismantle and display some perhaps different leadership ways of being, which other people will then have permission to utilise and leverage as well? So part of my leadership journey has been in the system, but alongside being in the system and working in schools and academy groups in the UK, I've also coexisted in the grassroots space. And I hope that through social media you'll be familiar with some of these organisations. So 6 years ago, I was one of the 7 women in education who co-founded the grassroots gender equality community called Women Ed. And the idea was, we were having a conversation on Twitter, and a few of us wrote a few blogs about glass ceilings and the inner critic and the imposter syndrome. And a conversation kind of spawned on social media, and very quickly it snowballed into us having an event. Microsoft were on Twitter, saw us talking about it, and offered to host us for an event, fully paid. They gave us a free venue in central London. And within a few months, we had 250 people at our very first event in London. And it was one of those days where it was like a palpable energy in the room, that you had these couple of hundred people who had travelled from all over the UK to come and talk about gender equality in education. And since then, 6 months on, there is a Women Ed MENA handle. I've stepped back from being involved with Women Ed because I have other things going on, but I know there's a lot of women in the region who are really trying to create that kind of momentum across the region in connecting people and building that grassroots space. So you might not have those visible female role models in the school you're working at, but by reaching out to other grassroots communities, that's where you can begin to build that circle. And the women I've met over the last 6 years, via Twitter, via LinkedIn, via events, it's been quite staggering how many role models I have identified and met who have now become part of my professional and personal circles, and who have actually had quite a lot of influence over me in my journey. As a consequence of Women Ed launching, a year later BAME Ed started, and that's a grassroots network for people of colour and their white allies. A year later, LGBT Ed started, as it says on the tin, a grassroots community for the LGBTQI community and their advocates and allies. And then just recently, just last autumn, a new grassroots community called Disability Ed has launched. Because statistically, 22% of society has a disability, but only 2% of teachers and leaders declare it. And we've got a big piece of work to be done there in destigmatising what it means to have a disability in education. And the final one there on the right-hand side, Diverse Educators, that is the community that I co-founded when I was a head teacher. And the idea was that my deputy head belonged to all 4 of those other networks. She had an intersectional identity. As a gay, brown, disabled woman, she had to cut herself into 4 every weekend and choose where to go. And we had a conversation one day at the gate about the need for an intersectional space, a space to have a joined up conversation, to connect the dots, and to actually think about the holistic approach to diversity, equity and inclusion. So I'm a bit of a fixer and a solutions kind of person. I don't like problems. I like to kind of like find ways around problems. And I literally just created Diverse Ed and started an event once a year, and it's kind of snowballed from there. So part of my work now independently is I run that organisation. So please do look them up. They've all got websites, they've all got newsletters, they've all got networks, and they've all got Twitter handles. And I highly recommend just the support and the connectivity and the community you'll get from all 5. So thinking about the fact that we are all women in education, we are all women leaders, I think we need to address the fact that collectively and individually there are barriers to female progression within our profession. I think some of the stats over in the UK are quite shocking around the fact that we have 250,000 women in education who have left our schools, who are no longer teaching, even though they're qualified teachers, because their schools will not allow them to work flexibly. And I know in your region there's different kind of regulations and rules around flexible working and working patterns, but it's just an interesting one to think about. There's some systemic and structural and societal barriers that prevent women from progressing or prevent women from being retained. The other statistic that I always refer to is the lack of representation at female headship level. When 2/3 of our profession are female, why are only 1/3 of our head teachers female? And I think there's an interesting piece there around a concrete ceiling for people of colour and the glass ceiling for women in the school system about where you can progress to. And we need to identify those barriers and think about how we can dismantle those barriers, not only for ourselves, but also for each other and the next generation coming into our profession as well. So RD did a big piece of research last year, and we asked a number of women in our network about what are the barriers internally and what are the barriers externally that impact your ability to be a resilient leader. I don't think there'll be any surprises here about the internal barriers. Confidence comes up in most of the conversations I have in the programs I run and the coaching I offer. Thinking about the confidence gap and how we can address that or redress that in both the adults and the young people. And lots of research sort of like looks towards secondary school being when our confidence dips, and it's quite often associated with when girls begin to menstruate or when they begin to wear bras. But actually the Dove research and looks at the fact that girls lose their confidence age 6, 7. So the Self-Esteem Project is all about what can we do in our primary schools. And if we think about the work we can do in our primary schools, how will that then sort of like be built on at secondary schools and then as we become adults in the system as well. The second one I've mentioned, sort of like voice already, this idea of struggling to be heard. There's some phrases out there like mansplaining, manterrupting, where we have dominant leadership behaviours quite often in leadership meetings and wider school spaces, where it's the person who speaks the loudest who is the person who is heard. So how do we interrupt and disrupt some of those spaces and conversations to make sure that all voices are being heard, but the quieter, softer, perhaps introverted voice is also being listened to as well? And then the third internal barrier is the imposter syndrome and the constant self-scrutiny, self-criticism, but also comparison with other people, where we tend to look inwardly at our deficits and the things we're not very good at, as opposed to look outwardly at affirming our strengths. So how can we think about these 3 barriers and find solutions around them for both ourselves, but also for each other? The external barriers, I don't think will be surprises either. So thinking about some of the unconscious biases when it comes to leadership, sort of like stereotypes, and this narrow or traditional perspective around leadership. I've listened to a Scottish doctor, Dr. Mary McLeod, share her research over the last year, and she's done this fascinating project looking at monkey communities and how we as humans can learn about leadership through the animal kingdom. And she's come up with this concept called the prestige leadership model, where in some of the monkey communities, such as the bonobo monkey group, it's a female-led community, and it's a democratic space, and it's a collapsed hierarchy when it comes to how that community is run. So as opposed to the more traditional communities of some of the other monkey groups, we have a very dominant male that organises the whole space. And I think that can be sort of like paralleled over to adult behaviours and school behaviours, thinking about the expectations of leaders, thinking about the language of adverts, thinking about what governors are looking for in their next head teacher, or even the word choices in the advert about the kind of behaviours you want for that role. So we need to be aware of these unconscious biases, but we also need to disrupt perhaps some of that stereotyping. The second one, this lack of appreciation for emotional intelligence. I'm not saying that men aren't emotionally intelligent, but I think women tend to be more naturally nurturing, and sometimes that isn't valued, or sometimes that gets pigeonholed into certain roles within a school environment. One of the things that I've observed over the last year, I do a lot of work in the diversity, equity and inclusion space. It seems to be a lot of women taking on that role because it's seen as being part of the nurturing, staff development, people development part of the school. How can we recognise and value the importance and the impact of emotional intelligence? And how can we disrupt perhaps some of the perceived weakness when it comes to emotionality? And then the final one is the lack of commitment to diversity. So some organisations might say that they want gender parity in their staffing structure and gender equality when it comes to their pay gap, but are the strategies and the practices and the policies in that space truly embracing diversity and identifying those barriers and removing them, or is it just perpetuating it and it's lip service and it's perhaps tokenistic? And that bottom image for me says it all. When you Google leaders, you have to scroll until you find a female leader. Quite often images and graphics have got this dominant white male leader. How can we disrupt some of the imagery and some of the representation when it comes to leadership as well? So thinking about visible role models, one of my sheroes, one of the people I really look up to is Jacinda Ardern. She gives me the imposter syndrome. I think she's 2 years younger than me. I think what she's achieved, both professionally and personally, is really very impressive. But I love the way she holds herself, and I love the way she really challenges some of those traditional masculine ideologies when it comes to leadership. She's quietly spoken. She's not loud. She breastfed on sort of like national news. She's always got a bit of banana on her shoulder because she's a mother. I just think how authentic she is and how real she is when it comes to her really embracing her personal and her professional identity. That is something that I think I look up to, the fact that she's got this lovely balance. She's also intentionally very inclusive, and how she's handled herself and some of the tragic incidents that have happened in the last year. I feel like she's really modelled the kind of behaviours, the inclusive behaviours that society needs. So I just wanted to put her out there as one of the women I look up to, and kind of like really sort of like observe for how she holds herself and has influence as a leader. So through our Lean, through our coaching and through Women Ed, we do a lot of storytelling, and I think I've learned a lot from listening to other people's stories, but I've also processed a lot by sharing my own story. So some of the bits of my own story I thought I'd share with you this afternoon about this idea of being real is that the journey I've been on for the last 10 years has been a kind of an emotional rollercoaster, shall we say, of different things that have punctuated that trajectory. So the week before I became a deputy head teacher, I broke up with my boyfriend who I was living with at the time. And I think just that context to being newly single and being a bit heartbroken, in all honesty, I threw myself into my role and I became all consumed by being a deputy head teacher. It was very much my way of surviving and getting through that painful sort of period. And I probably came up for air about 6 months later, 9 months later. And I think that's when I realised I'd kind of lost myself in the role. I'd lost Hannah. I was just performing the role as opposed to really thinking about how I was showing up in that role. Fast forward 2 years later, having had some coaching, I realised I wasn't actually that happy in that school. I could do the role. I was quite happy doing a deputy headship role, but I wasn't in the right context. I wasn't in the right cultural fit. I wasn't liking the behaviours around me on that all-male SLT. I was challenging them. I was finding it quite challenging to be authentic and to be resilient. If you going to the top right one there, that was when I began to think about becoming a head teacher. I wasn't necessarily looking for headship, but I've been a deputy head for a few years, and I was tapped on my shoulder by a couple of people in my network to apply for headship. And I ended up being at headship interviews as the only female repeatedly. Not only the only female candidate, but the whole panel looking to recruit me was also all male. And there was very much some unconscious bias that I saw and I observed and I heard, to the extent that in one of the interviews, I got thanked for being the only girl in the room. I ended up relocating, leaving London, moving up to Oxfordshire as a singleton to take on a new headship. And that was quite a massive undertaking. I don't think I necessarily took stock of it at the time. I just kind of cracked on and made it work. But the resilience, and I'm sure a lot of you who have moved internationally regularly, the resilience of throwing my whole support network up in the air and relocating and starting over, it was both exciting but also draining, because it took up a lot of energy and a lot of consideration, and my friendships and my relationships had to flex and had to change. 3 years on, having been ahead for 3 years, I had a bit of a fallout with the Daily Mail. So the Daily Mail, if you're not from England, is one of our lower grade tabloid newspapers, and they're not very pro-diversity, shall we say. So we were doing a lot of work, impactful work at our school around diversity, equity, inclusion. And the Oxford Mail, the regional version of the paper, picked up on it and made a story out of it. And I ended up being a headline on the national news for about a week. I had the BBC camped outside my school trying to get an interview. And it was all over something really minuscule, one of our policies that had been in place for 3 years, but clearly they were just looking for a kind of a newsworthy story that week. I don't think I really knew how resilient I was until I was in the tabloids, until I was receiving hate mail, until I had to really dig deep to do assemblies when I was feeling emotionally quite challenged, and run staff meetings with a staff body who were feeling very under attack in the kind of the local and national media. The final image is just capturing for me the kind of the toxic behaviours and cultures that I have ended up inadvertently experiencing at periods throughout my career. And toxic behaviours actually more often from females than from males. I've had a couple of situations I dealt with in my 20-year career where I've had other female leaders who have been threatened by me, who have then become quite difficult to work with, quite territorial. The kind of the metaphor of the queen bee has been alive and very loud. And I think that's been a learning curve for me about how to navigate those types of personalities, and how to stay authentic and how to keep my integrity when actually some people are almost looking to trip you up along the way. So that's just a little bit of my story and how I've thought about, I've reflected on, I've developed, and I've been quite intentional about this idea of being real. So I think it's just important to recognise that every one of us has got a story, and sometimes those stories are internalised and they're not shared. And the kind of spaces that I like to create in coaching spaces, in leadership programs, at events, is creating safe spaces where we can connect and we can share our stories and we can listen to each other's stories, and we can learn through those shared stories. So that's the kind of space I want to create for us in the activities we're going to share with you that are coming. So thinking about the journeys we are on and thinking about the choices that we make, I've done a lot of thinking about the idea of like linear journeys versus non-linear journeys. Quite often in education, our journeys are linear until we have children. We climb the ladder, and then as Sheryl Sandberg says, it then becomes a jungle gym when we have children and we go off in a different direction. So thinking about squiggly careers rather than linear careers, and if you've not heard the podcast or read the book Squiggly Careers, I highly recommend it. Thinking about how we can have a plan for our futures, but those plans aren't always what happen, and how can we be versatile and flexible about those options. And those three icons on the right hand side are the work I've done on my own, sort of like thinking about how I articulate myself on my journey, thinking about my vision and my mission and my values. I like to use the kind of the metaphors of going on a journey and thinking about looking through the telescope and looking at the goals. Thinking about how we anchor ourselves and how we hold fast and how our values actually are the resilience piece. And there's a metaphor that I use quite a lot, and I can't remember who says this quote, about the fact that ships weren't built to stay in the harbour. And you don't know how strong a ship is or how effective a ship is until it's put out onto the open seas. And I think some of the bits of my narrative I share with you this afternoon are incidents and opportunities and experiences that have made me much stronger and much clearer on who I am, and much more aware of my own skills, qualities and strengths, and how aware I can have impact. So if you've not experienced coaching, I'd very much recommend coaching as a way to do that self-exploration, that self-affirmation. So maybe just take a moment to think about the journey you've been on and the journey you're on and where you are heading. And maybe also just think about how, by becoming part of this community we want to grow, just by making those connections and relationships and identifying those role models, how that might actually help you on your journey as a woman leader in education as well. So my sort of like commitment as a coach and a leadership development consultant and trainer is about empowering each of us to lead that change, and that change needs to happen in both ourselves and in others. And that act of empowering is about us working together and sharing expertise and experiences so we can each learn from each other. And that metamorphosis from a caterpillar to a butterfly. So thinking about this idea of empowered women, empowering the world, I've just pulled out a couple of the images, the language that I reflect on when it comes to this idea of empowerment. And I think that one bottom middle is really important to me. Not everyone likes to use the word tribe, but I use the word tribe in the fact that I have intentionally and deliberately, over the last 6-7 years, built a tribe of women around me. Women who are resilient, empowered, authentic leaders, women who have got a strong sense of integrity and values and ethics. And I think finding those kindred spirits and building those meaningful relationships has very much made me a much stronger, much more positive and a much more grounded leader as a consequence. So that's hopefully one of the outcomes that we can co-create through this space and through these activities. So some ways forward. Thinking about how we can connect you all, how we can build a community, how we can then seek to create or co-create collaborations, how we can identify and nurture those relationships such as critical friends. I think critical friendships have been a really important part of my journey, particularly being the only female in certain spaces. Finding other women working at the same level in other organisations has really helped me navigate some of the obstacles. Thinking about how some coaching opportunities, sort of group coaching, programmatic coaching might help, and how we can then champion each other and ourselves and do that affirmation of what it means to be a woman leader. So a bit about our conference. Our first real women's conference will be in June, as Rebecca's already mentioned. The day is going to be a mixture of keynotes and workshops, a panel with lots of regional women leaders on it, and an opportunity to network. Some of the themes we're going to be exploring are the ideas of what it means to be an empowered leader, a compassionate leader, a confident leader, an authentic leader. If there are other themes that you'd like us to explore, please do get in contact with Infinite Learning. The people who I'm bringing to contribute are quite flexible, and if they have enough time with a request, we can make sure we build in the things that you most want to talk about. So some of the people you're going to get to meet. For the workshops and for the keynotes, if you're on Twitter, I'm sure you already know who Diana Sagi is. Diana is one of those women who you cannot ignore when you're in the room. I met Diana when I was doing my MPQH many years ago. She had a massive impact on me immediately. She is a powerhouse, that's all I'm going to say. Hopefully you're going to absolutely love her. She puts rockets up bottoms very, very regularly. On the other side of me, there's then Dr. Jill Berry. Jill Berry is one of those people who I used to follow on Twitter. She then published her book, Making the Leap, which was the results of her doctorate study, looking at the transition from deputy headship to headship. And she followed 6 deputy heads for the year they got their headships and when they became a head. So I always used to follow her and look up to her. She was one of my thought leaders, but she's someone who I've now become friends with over time. I just love listening to her. She is a wise woman with 40 years worth of experience of working in a range of different schools. So hopefully her name's already on your radar. Yamina Bibi is somebody who I've met over the last few years. She's involved with Women Ed London. Just yesterday, she actually won an Emerging Woman Leadership Award over in the UK. She's the first hijab-wearing senior leader at a school as of September, and she's also one of the coaches I work with. So we've got a really nice mixture there, hopefully, of our conference workshop facilitators. And then our local leaders, our regional leaders who are going to be on our panel. You might recognise some of these faces and some of these names. A mixture of people. We've got deputy heads, subject leaders, a North Anglia's new diversity, equity, inclusion leader, a primary head, a secondary head, a wellbeing leader, and a safeguarding leader. So a real mixture of women from diverse backgrounds with diverse experiences who are going to share with you what this idea of real means to them and some of the things that have perhaps helped them along their journey as well. Other things that Rebecca, Paula and I are talking about, so an opportunity to blog, to read blogs, to create blogs, to share blogs. I'm launching a podcast in the next few weeks, the Real Podcast. I would absolutely love if some of you want to come on and be interviewed on that. I'm a massive reader, and these are just some of the books I recommend when it comes down to this idea of being a real woman. So we're thinking that perhaps a book club might be a nice idea to connect if we chose a book each term and we could come together to unpack it. And then based on feedback of the kind of things you want to be talking about, we are proposing a series of real webinars in the build-up into next academic year. Ultimately, what we want to do is hold a face-to-face conference. We've been talking about it now for about 2 years. So hopefully, all being well, there'll be a face-to-face conference at some point in the future around International Women's Day, so a spring conference. So next steps, we would love to see you in June. Rebecca will tell you more about the deal and the discount in a second. Please do connect with Infinite Learning and myself, Ethical Leader, on social media. Spread the word. Talk to friends and colleagues and other people who might be interested in coming. And let us know what else you would like from the opportunities we've shared today. So please do pop any comments or questions or reflections into the chat. And Rebecca, I'll hand back over to you.
Anna, thank you so very much indeed. You spoke there about role models, and I think you're certainly a role model for all women, and particularly those women in education. You've obviously been on a journey yourself and have taken so much from that, and I think we can all learn from you and from your experiences, and I'm sure we can all relate to them. There were so many things that were so pertinent to me. I think generally it was, you talked about things that were very familiar to me, but had not perhaps been articulated in such a clear way that has given me real food for thought, actually. Lots of things that sounded, yes, I'm sure I know about this, I'm sure we've talked about this before, but actually have we really unpicked that? And that was really thought-provoking for me. You know, I've lived in the Middle East for 25 years, and I've worked in education in different guises for most of that. And I'm constantly struck by how many strong and powerful women there are in education. We actually see it'd be interesting to see actually the proportion of women in leadership, let's just say in the UAE even, compared to the UK. And I'm not sure how those stats would match up, but I have had the absolute pleasure of working alongside so many you know, strong women leaders in education. So you know, we potentially have the power to form a really strong group. And I think actually, you know, that you came to that at the end, and actually for me that's perhaps the biggest takeaway, that collectively we have all the opportunity here to be part of something really powerful and really important, and to actually make a change. And as you said at the beginning, there's the question of changing the now, but actually it's about changing the future, isn't it? And about, you know, I've got, my daughter is 13, so she's at that age where she's very impressionable, and I hope that I'm a good role model for her. She sees me working hard at my job, and she hopefully sees me, you know, enjoying my home life as well. But that was another thing, that work alignment, home, In my field currently, obviously, as most of you know, I'm co-founder of Infinite Learning, and in a way we kind of run our own organisation. So I would say perhaps that is quite nicely aligned, because I'm not having to be anybody different in this environment most of the time. But I think going into a school or any institution that's quite traditional in its makeup might be more of a challenge for me. So anyway, I could waffle on at length. I loved the mask analogy. I loved the breaking free of the mold. I just thought there was so much, as I say, really for me, squiggly careers. That was a great one. I hadn't heard that one either. And yes, absolutely. Gosh, we really do go like that. And anyway, overall, I just thought there was so much content there, and I'm so excited for the conference, and I hope all of our attendees today are as well. You know, if that's the tip of the iceberg, well, we're going to have a big swim in the sea, aren't we? It was absolutely fantastic. So thank you so much. I'm not sure if you've got any questions, maybe perhaps reflections. If any of you want to share any thoughts, or you do indeed have any questions for Hannah, please feel free to add those in now. As Hannah mentioned, and as I mentioned at the start, we are having our Real Women Conference on Saturday, the 26th of June. I'll get it right this time. However, we are offering an early bird booking rate, which is until tomorrow. So you've got all of tomorrow to make your booking on our website. The direct link will be in the follow-up email that will come out from Sarah in an hour or so. And if you book by tomorrow, there is a saving there of 75 dirhams. We've really deliberately tried to keep the price as low as possible. It's very low for a full-day conference, with exposure to all those incredible speakers and involvement with, I should say. And we've worked really hard to get some high-profile speakers, but also to give that contextualized experience with our local speakers, and for you to be able to engage with those in smaller workshop groups. So it really is a fantastic opportunity for your own growth and development, but as we said, to be part of that bigger piece, that collective, you know, where the sum is greater than its parts. I really believe that's the case in this instance. So do go and have a look at that at least, and as Hannah said, share, spread the word, and let your colleagues know about what's coming up. Carry on writing questions if you have any. I'll go have another look there in a moment. Just to point out that actually in a important and actually quite related webinar that we have coming up next on the 7th of June, this is all about training resilient leaders in schools. It's again actually by an inspirational role model for me, a lady called Dr. Leslie Hunter. If you've worked in Dubai or any of the Talim schools, I can see Tanya has been on the group, so Tanya will definitely know of Dr. Leslie, and we're working with her to bring some really exciting work around leadership and developing resilience around that. So do go have a look at that as well. That's taking place on the 7th of June. I'm just going to have one more quick check for any questions or comments or feedback. If you can't think of anything now, but do have some subsequent to this meeting, please do drop myself an email. If it's a question specifically for Hannah, I can forward that on. Connect with all the groups that Hannah mentioned earlier. And otherwise, unless there's anything coming in which I can't see, I think they're all kind of in deep thought, Hannah, reflecting on those words of wisdom that you've shared with us. And I should also say thank you very much for sharing your own personal story. I always think that's quite a courageous thing to do, but one that's so valuable for people so they can empathise and relate. So I will say my final thanks and goodbye to all of you. Thank you for joining us. Hannah, thank you once again for your time. And we look forward to seeing all of you, we hope, on Saturday, the 26th of June. And remember to register tomorrow to get that early bird discount.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
All right. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Bye.